Thank you for carrying out our work.
Yes, you're welcome.
So anyway, this is the Thompson family plot as far as we know. Zadock Thompson is probably buried around here, but it's really, really hard to read these tombstones, so we're not actually sure. Go ahead, sir.
I think I'm here. I mean, I know I'm here, but I think I'm here. I was very privileged to live the life I lived, I feel, although it was often a struggle. I was born in 1796, and I was a naturalist and a historian. Not at first. I was born in poverty and on a poor farm that my family ran, and my brother and I worked hard at. But I was lucky because early on, I have notes here because I've been gone a while. Early on, during the maple sugaring season, I was cutting wood for my father, and I almost chopped my foot off. And almost bled to death, and luckily I was laid up and healed, and they sewed everything back together, which gave me a lot of time to lay around the house and read, which I much preferred, according to my brother. He said I gave early evidence that I like to read better than work. Although I was a little hurt by that and stung, it was true. And after that I was determined to go to school, to complete school, because I hadn't been able to as a child. So I decided to go to UVM, which almost broke my bank at $69.25 for 3 years education. 3 years education. But during that time, my love of reading and the natural world, and our history of the state, I decided that I wanted to chronicle this for people. And I realized that a respectable library for the use of the naturalist could not be culled from all the public and private libraries and all the bookstores in the state. So I felt that there was a great need to write down all of our history, and natural and civic and otherwise. So after my graduation of UVM, and while contemplating what I wanted to do, I was lucky and pleased to marry my childhood sweetheart, Phoebe Boyd, who helped me in all my efforts through our lives and well beyond mine. Sadly, our children passed, and I'll let you tell them about that.
I'll handle it.
Kind of a downer,
Yes.
and I don't want to bring it up.
It's fine.
So in the 1850s, I became the state naturalist, but that was after trying to start a couple of failed attempts at being a publisher and natural gazettes. We published the first one in 1824. It was not a financial success, to say the least. After that, I worked for UVM for a while and wrote a scrappy history of Vermont. I compiled Thompson's Vermont, finishing it in 1841. And some of my books were the 1824 Gazetteer of the State of Vermont, the 1833's History of the State of Vermont, 1842 History of Vermont, Natural, Civic, and Statistical, 1845's Northern Guide, and 1848's Geography and Geology of the State of Vermont. And of course, 1849's first book of geography for Vermont children, and 1850 Natural History. I wrote a lot. They sometimes were popular, sometimes weren't popular. In the course of our efforts, my wife and I started the first Burlington High School for young women, which also failed.
4 years, though, better than
4 years, better than most of our
what
efforts.
most people were doing for women at the time.
Yes, that's true. So I'll let you tell more about that and some of our efforts. Chief Vermont School. As we began our work, we were aware the accomplishment of our design would be attended with much labor and difficulty. So we went into it fully knowing that the Iris and Burlington Literary Magazine, the repository, A Brief History of the Tea Plant, one of my favorite essays, was going to fail miserably. But we kept trying. And then, of course, the high point of my career, by the time I was we did move to Canada for a little while.
Yes.
And came back for 4 years, and we loved it here.
I have a story about that.
Okay, we loved it here, so we ended up back. But then I was the state naturalist for Vermont, and I got that phone call telegraph
Messenger, probably.
asking me to come out to Charlotte because in the construction of the railroad, some construction workers had unearthed what they thought was a large horse or animal or something, but the construction manager realized it was something different and they called me out, and I rightfully guessed that it was a whale. And they had smashed up the skull, but we pulled it aside and reassembled the skull and found the vertebrae largely intact, as if it had just settled at the bottom of a salt marsh swamp and been covered. And I put it back together and traveled with it to Boston, where I met renowned naturalists and scientific people who agreed with my initial assessment, and we decided that it was probably the bones of a beluga whale from the Champlain Sea, which helped illustrate that story of our past and how the ice age left us with the sea.
Is
that was
St.
more.
Mike's?
I'm sorry.
And it's at St. Mike's.
Yes, it is. It's on display still, and that was even better than the gigantic elephant I found.
No. It was a woolly mammoth.
Woolly mammoths. They look like elephants. There was nothing.
Harebrained ideas.
Please share the accurate story of
Okay.
our lives, if you would.
Are you done?
You know me, I'm never done.
You're never
but-
done.
but I'll take a reprieve.
You were a man of many words. You could not be stopped. But what is interesting, and as amazing as you were, is that you kind of have to read between the lines of history to understand what an important part Phoebe Thompson, myself, had in Zadock Thompson's career. And of course it's not, until more recently going to really be put out there that this woman, a wife of the famed naturalist, was actually working just about as hard as her husband was to make all of his ideas happen. My name would not have showed up on the books or as a publisher. That was just not done at the time. And, like an early to mid 19th century woman, I just, settled into my place as being his support and raising my children and working full time for him and running a school and editing all of his papers and doing a lot of research and traveling with him. But it's
Good old
only
days.
But so to tell just a little bit more about my story, which I think is really important for people to know, Zadock, you were amazing. I was pretty great too.
I couldn't have done it without you, obviously.
So we were childhood sweethearts in Bridgewater, and I was there when he had his foot almost chopped off. I traveled with him to Burlington. Do you remember the story though about how you raised that money to get through school? Is that
Printing the pamphlets?
Yes, you started recording information about the meteorological history and contemporary data of Vermont, creating these almanacs modeled on the famous almanacs that were being published at the time. I sewed the bindings for you and helped you assemble these books, which you went around and sold door to door to raise money for your education. And eventually we were able to purchase a house right at University Green, right? And that's with the grant, and it was a pretty nice big house. We had a little cottage in the back, it was lovely gardens. You had all your
Animals and everything.
specimens,
Books. It's not
animals.
hoarding if it's your business, right? And it was our business.
But the School for Women really was a joint project of the two of us, and unfortunately it really didn't make money. I think, Zadock, you were ahead of your time. We were ahead of our time. Women were not being educated. The value of an education for women was not really understood yet. And of course, that being said, education for women at the time consisted of being polite, dutiful, well-educated housewives. Not that they were going to go have a career or anything, but maybe be supportive to their husbands. Eventually, you were able to pursue all of your various pursuits, and there were so many. I did want to tell the story about when we moved to Canada, though. You took a teaching job at a little school in Quebec. things were not working out well in Burlington. All the literary magazines were just failing. So we said, let's take a change, you know, go somewhere else. You tried to write a textbook for school children on the history, the cultural and natural history of Quebec, because you were obviously an expert in Quebec, having grown up in Burlington and Bridgewater.
Right, and having been there for a minute.
Right, having lived there for about 6 months, you undertook this endeavor, and it did not go over well. Your textbook was not very complete. It sort of became, unfortunately, the laughingstock of Quebec. So we spent a few years there, and then decided it was time to come back to Burlington, where you actually had, you know,
some things.
you knew things about Burlington and Vermont. So that's how we came back to Burlington, but we ended up living in the little cottage behind our main house and selling our main house. So this was right on University Green. You know, after you passed, I actually spent probably close to 20 years still in the cottage in Burlington, and money was always tight. You passed in 1856
Thank
and
you for recording that in the
Yes,
almanac.
yes, yeah. Yes, because I continued on the, you know, recording the temperature of each day diligently in your notebooks, and then on the day you died, just saying, Mr. Thompson passed at 5 p.m. And that was that. And I got on with it. And and in 1857, because you were serving as a state naturalist, you had a cabinet of specimens and curiosities in the State House. I realized it was pretty valuable. I needed the money, so I sold it to the state of Vermont for $1,000. So that was super helpful. But for 3 years after that, I continued to travel to Montpelier to maintain this cabinet of specimens and make sure it was clean, add to it, just check in on it. Finally, I realized, gosh, I've been doing this work for free for 3 years and not getting paid, and no one's recognizing me. So I went in front of the Appropriations Committee in the House, in Congress, and advocated for myself to be paid for my services to this state.
That's what I always loved about you.
Yeah, you know, it's just because I'm a woman doesn't mean I shouldn't get paid. So, as one person said, who was chairing the committee at the time, I am very much inclined to go for it, meaning to pay me, as Mrs. T is the first woman this year at least who has made a claim against the Treasury. So this was a very rare thing. Hardly ever happened. I think I got $125 for my services, but at least I got something, and they heard my cause. And eventually I moved to Northfield. And sadly, 2 of our 3 children died in childhood. The other child who lived the longest, Adeline, lived till 30. She had 4 grandkids, and I outlived her, so I went to live with my grandchildren in Northfield. I'm not sure where I'm buried. It may be in Northfield. If anyone knows, please let me know. I think I'm going to have to research that. I'm not in the record of the cemetery, but again, as Karen was saying, there are a lot of people who just are not recorded or do not have a marker here. But for many years I went on and did successive printings of your almanacs and your gazetteers and continued to sell them for money. And then it was really only much later in the 19th century did historians start to really understand what a contribution you made, and by default then me as well, to the state. So thank you. No, these are Thompsons from.
Are you just making that up?
Well, the Thompsons, you are from Bridgewater,
Right.
so your family is all down in Bridgewater. So I don't believe, I would think that the Thompsons Point has a longer history than, and if we came up here in the 1820s, 1830s, then yeah, that would have been earlier, a different Thompson.
All right, we're gonna make our way to a mysterious grave, and then we have a few more spots. Yes, sir.
I'm just wondering, the origin of the older stones here, are they largely from the Berry quarries, or where does the stone come from?
It's definitely all local stone. It's not from far away. Off the top of my head, though, I'm not sure.